The Flintridge and Portola Valley Railroad, a beautiful masterpiece of 7.5-inch gauge railroading, a beautiful collaboration between two neighbors and a friend who made a significant contribution to the live steam hobby. Taking detailed accuracy to a whole new level, they have made leaps and bounds in donating their experience to the hobby. The railroad has been covered by Mike Massey and several live steam magazines dedicated to the hobby, but that chapter ended in the mid-2010s when the railroad shut down. But what happened to the rolling stock, the buildings, the track, the engines? Well, like all good stories, we have to start at the beginning. The Denver and Rio Grande, a name that is synonymous with high-stakes mountain railroading. Incorporated on October 27, 1870 by General William Jackson Palmer, the railroad quickly gained the name Baby Road, a reference to the 3-foot gauge of the track the railroad was built to. Starting out from Denver and building south towards El Paso via Pueblo, the railroad faced challenges such as the 1877 to 1880 Railroad War between them and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, who had already beaten them to El Paso, fighting for control over the route through the Royal Gorge, with the DNRG eventually winning control of the route. Gaining the motto, through the Rockies, not around them, and later, mainline through the Rockies, the railroad made its push through the Rockies over the next decade, setting their sights on Salt Lake City. The DNRG built west from Pueblo, Colorado, reaching Cannon City in 1874. The line through the Royal Gorge reached Salida, Colorado on May 20th, 1880, and was pushed to Leadville, Colorado that same year. From Salida, the DNRG pushed west over the Continental Divide at the 10,845-foot Marshall Pass and reached Gunnison, Colorado on August 6, 1881. Eventually, the line would push further west, meeting another line, ironically named the Denver and Rio Grande Western, near present-day Green River, Utah. Farther south, the San Juan Extension, a line from Alamosa, Colorado, started being laid across the southern edge of the state, with a branch line, nicknamed the Chili Line, running down into Santa Fe. The rest of the line ran west, jumping between the state line of Colorado and New Mexico over Cumbres Pass, and down into Chama, New Mexico, before heading northwest towards Durango, Colorado, with a branch line to Silverton to the north of Durango to tap into the rich mining areas around the town, the line being completed in July of 1882. Other railroads joined into the narrow gauge craze as well. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railway in 1872, building a line westward through the Platte Canyon, and later creating the headache that was the Alpine Tunnel, arriving in Gunnison in 1882. These were followed by the Silverton Railroad of 1888, the Rio Grande Southern in 1889, the Silverton Northern in 1895, and the Silverton, Gladstone, and Northerly Railroad in 1899. But all of these lines had one common problem they shared: the climb. Back when the Rio Grande was first founded, they started out with a locomotive fleet of 2 4-0s, that is, 2 leading wheels, 4 driving wheels, and 0 trailing wheels, along with a fleet of 2 6-0s. While the 2 4-0s could handle the flatlands with heavy loads, they couldn't crest the Rockies due to their small size and power output. The 2 6-0s could do the job with 2 of them in a doubleheader, but not by themselves. It was not uncommon for trains to have a locomotive in the middle of the train or at the rear. The DNRG needed more power. The 2 6-0s could be made bigger to give them that power, but there was a problem: weight. An engine with bigger cylinders and a bigger boiler would increase its power, but the major downside was weight. Bridges and track were built quickly in those days, and safety wasn't exactly at the forefront of every section of track built. A heavier locomotive on bad track could cause a derailment or spread the rails apart, or even cause a cheap and shoddily constructed bridge to collapse. What the Rio Grande needed was an engine that was more powerful than the 2 6-0s, but with its weight spread out. Enter the 280. Between 1881 and 1882, 82 Class 60 280 consolidation-type locomotives were built and placed in service on the Denver and Rio Grande. 28 engines, numbers 200 through 227, were built by the Grant Locomotive Works. 54 engines, numbers 240 through 295, excluding numbers 292 and 293, were built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. Later, 2 Class 56 280s were rebuilt and added to the Class 60 roster. There were slight differences between the Grant Class 60s and the Baldwin Class 60s, most notably in their driver spacing, the dome contour, and the cab roof contour, though their power output was the same. Built with 15 by 20-inch cylinders, a boiler pressure of 160 psi, and 8 36 3/4 diameter drivers, these little engines could put out a whopping 14,989 pounds of tractive effort. Now that might not sound like much, but for its time it was quite powerful. These 280s, weighing approximately 60,000 pounds, hence the name Class 60, were the workhorses of the DNRG, working hard through the Rockies day and night, rain or shine, for 30 plus years. Going through rebuilding twice, the Class 60s were eventually reclassified to C16s. The second rebuild gave them a larger, all-steel boiler, increasing their weight by approximately 10,000 pounds. The added weight increased their tractive effort from 14,989 pounds to 16,100 pounds, hence the reclassification. But even 2 rebuilds and a reclassification couldn't stop their demise. Between February and April of 1903, the Denver and Rio Grande had their first 282s built, labeled as Class 125s, later known as the K-27s. By 1924, the K-28s came out, followed swiftly by the K-36s and later the K-37s. With the narrow gauge lines dwindling, the C-16s, due to their lighter weight, were relegated to lightly laid lines or branches, while the Ks took over the majority of their work. By 1937, only 4 remained: 223, 268, 271, and 278. 271 ended up serving as the Durango switcher, while 223, 268, and 278 remained in Gunnison, operating on the remaining branches there. The DNR-GW would later buy the Baldwin branch in 1937. The line was upgraded over the years, but the bridges weren't, giving the C-16s more time on their clock. But eventually the clock ran out, and one by one, the C-16's reign on the narrow gauge came to an end. 271 was sold to the Montezuma Lumber Company northwest of Dolores, Colorado on the RGS. It lasted there until 1947. In December of 1941, 223 was leased to Salt Lake City, Utah for display. This left 278 and 268 running the lines in Gunnison. When the coal ran dry in the mines of Crested Butte in 1952, that was the end for the both of them. The DNR-GW filed for abandonment of the lines, and it was granted the following fall. With that, the line through the heart of the Rockies was gone. But the story of the C-16s didn't end there. Born on March 31st, 1944, Ron Schmidt loved trains. He had a passion for them his entire life. He graduated from South San Francisco High School and continued his education at UC Berkeley, where he received his PhD in electrical engineering in 1970. A year earlier, he married his wife, Lila Schmidt. After completing his PhD, he and Lila moved to England, where he went on to do postdoctoral work at the University College in London before joining Bell Labs in Holmdel, New Jersey. 7 years later, they migrated west, where he worked at Xerox PARC before co-founding Synoptics Communications. He was first and foremost an engineer at heart. Although he was a man of few words, his words were impactful. I had the incredible honor of interviewing his widow for this documentary. So, tell me, how did you and Ron get involved with Peter and starting the railroad and all that?
Oh, that's a lovely story. We moved in next door, and we were doing some remodeling of the house, and so we had to submit plans to the town, and Ronald wanted a train room, so the train room was on the plans. Well, Peter thought it was, train as in maybe a training room with like weights and horrid things like that. But he found out that it was a train room, and so he had a 1 inch to the foot, right? He had the small gauge next door, and Ronald was just so excited.
In 1991, Ron and his wife moved 2 houses down from Peter Moseley, a model railroader himself and a live steam fan as well. He owned a lot of 1-inch scale equipment from his father, Francis Moseley. Together the two built the F&PV at 1-inch scale, which equates to a 4 3/4 inch track gauge. So I remember looking at the track map of how it was all set up. It's like, how were you guys able to afford a second house? Because I know you guys lived at the far end of the railroad, and then you had a second house where the track ran through the property. How did you guys manage that?
Well, that actually came up. It was a funky house, and this was a number of years ago. But we found out that it was for sale, and our realtor, a lovely woman, she said, "Well, if that goes to somebody else, they might build a McMansion." And of course, that was the impetus, and so we bought the house. Yeah. That's how we got it, just because we wanted to protect ourselves, because we had, of course, the Mosleys on one side, who were wonderful, and then then we could protect ourselves on the other side.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
So that was that was just a good, it was a good investment. It
Yeah,
was a really
I
good
can I can
investment.
imagine that would have been interesting because, you know, if someone actually did end up buying the house and then you had the railroad going through, it'd be like, hey, I need you to pay me a certain amount of money each month for this to, you know, be a
Yeah,
thing.
right. A toll, right? A
Yeah,
toll. Yeah,
right.
but no, as it worked out, it was just perfect.
All the
It
stars
really worked
aligned and
out well.
everything worked out just fine.
Yeah, yeah. It was very good. So that was no, it was a great setup. It was just a great setup.
Eventually, after several derailments, nicknamed Derailathons, Peter and Ron agreed that bigger was better and joined a project that Bill Bowler and Stan Marshall were working on. The project was a recreation of the Denver and South Park and Pacific 280s, specifically DSP and P45, built by the Cook Locomotive Works at 2.5-inch scale, running on 7.5-inch gauge track. When Ron and Peter got involved, Ron noticed that the 45 had similar running gear to the DNRG C16s. Ron had always been fascinated by the Colorado narrow gauge railroads. Stan wanted to have his Denver, South Park, and Pacific 280, so the 3 of the 4 locomotives in the project would become a C16, while the 4th would be built as originally intended. However, upon further inspection, it was discovered that DSP and P45 was vastly different from what the C16s were, and Ron, Peter, and Bill eventually started from scratch, reusing very little of what remained from the original project, only reusing the spring rigging and the cylinders. Stan's engine would eventually be sold off due to his age and his backing out of the project, being bought by Ray Burgum, who completed it as Stan originally intended. Ron and Peter made several trips out to Colorado, taking detailed measurements of the more accessible C16s, specifically 278 and 268, which had remained more or less where they were after retirement back in the 1950s. Ron, being very specific with attention to detail, recreated dings and dents that existed on the real locomotives and could still be found today. A good example would be the tender shells. They are different on each engine. 278 and the 268 Bumblebee were straight-sided, with the 268 being shorter and narrower, whereas in 1938 the 268 had a flared tender tank. 268 at some point had broken the crosshead hanger on one side and had a doubler as a repair. She had also lost one of her original footboards as well. All of these details and differences were applied to the individual models. Some may have called Ron a rivet counter, but I found it quite impressive with the level of attention to detail he had. Other engines joined the fleet as well. Ron had Role Models Inc. build the railroad its number 1. Based on a GE 70-tonner, it was powered by a Kubota tractor motor and mostly used for switching the steam engines around. However, it was also used along with the first built DNR GW50 switcher, also by RMI, to pull visitors or family around the track when the steam engines were not fired up. A model of RGS Goose number 6 was built by Jack Sessoms, as well as a model of DNR GW 464, a K27 built by Rich Yulin of Yulin Locomotive Works. Obviously, you told me a little bit about your connection to the project. Which locomotives were modeled?
Well, we started with the idea. We had a drawing for a frame, which actually was a Cook, and there were 3 of us involved, and two people we haven't mentioned yet, John Grant and Stan Marshall. And so John and Stan and I started to build these locomotives, and the inspiration for it was in fact one of those postcards of the Bumblebee. So it was kind of with that thought it was going. And for a variety of reasons, that project got to the point where we actually had one frame operating on air and the boilers were partially done and what have you. We were all working busy jobs and trying to, pay for the rent. And the project was never fully completed, and when it came apart, all of the stuff sat in my house for a number of years. And then through my friend Peter Mosley and his next door neighbor, who I did not know at that time, Ron Schmidt, it came down, and I already mentioned that Ron was a narrow gauge nut, just absolutely a Colorado narrow gauge expert, who was into HO and O gauge, or O and 3, and Garden Railroad and everything else in the world. And Peter brought him down to my house, and he saw these C16 chassis and what have you, and
fan nerd.
Yeah, it was getting Ron interested was like falling downhill. You know, it was really rather easy. So Stan Marshall re-engaged, and Peter and Ron joined, and so there were 4 of us, and the intent then was that we would build 4 engines. The original intent was to build 4 engines with 3 of us, and we would sell one to try and recoup some of the cost of the 3 that we maintained. When we restarted the project with the 4 of us, then each one got an opportunity to select an engine that they were going to do, and so the 3 engines were 268 in 2 versions. This is 268 as it looked in 1955, which was at the end of its life, and it was the last operating C-16 on the railroad.
Okay.
Its last activity was to pull up track and ties and take it to the scrapyard. It worked in its last few years along with 278, and it's intriguing to respect the fact that there's only 3 of these engines remaining in the world. It's 268, 278, and 223, and key to their survival, among other things, was the fact that there was a branch that went from Gunnison up to town Baldwin, which is no longer there, which is at Crested Butte. Mm-hmm. And one of the things up there, besides the ranchers and farmers that used the railroad, was a coal mine. And the coal from that mine, listen, they're playing our song. One of the things of value was the coal from that mine, especially during the war years, for a steel mill in Pueblo, Colorado.
Okay.
But since that was a branch line, that I don't know when it was put in, but it was clearly, you know, 1890s vintage, you know, and so it had light rail track and light trestles and bridges and what have you. And to keep that operational through the war and what have you, they couldn't take the big Ks up there because the bridges would fail. So they needed to have some of the smaller engines, and so the 3 engines, 223, 268, 278, were brought back to that area and kept from Gunnison, servicing that route. And that's really caused them to survive the war and therefore survive. So that's why the 3 of those are remaining.
All right, and I'm trying to remember, was one of them involved in a roundhouse fire?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, because I remember reading something about a C-16 being in a roundhouse fire and basically getting restored and brought back because it was like the only one that it was not so badly damaged.
Well, then it's quite possible, because what happened was, if you remember, in fact, Walt Disney was with Ward Kimball, went to this event in 1949. There was a rail fair, in Chicago, and the DNRGW was still painting its engines in then the green colors, the green coaches, and the black engines. And to reintroduce or to rebrand DNRGW, they came up with the new paint scheme, including this Grande gold or aspen gold, some people refer to it as. And that color was chosen in 1949, and it was introduced to the world by taking an engine and making it look like one of their original engines. That engine had a name on it, and it was a wood-burning engine with a big diamond stack. It had a big kerosene lamp on it, a long wooden pilot, and what it was in 1880s.
Right.
So they wanted to have one of their original engines there. They didn't have the original engine, but they had this engine, 268, that was built in 1882, as one of the first 20 that they bought in that time. And so they said, we'll make it look like that, and we'll characterize it, and we'll paint it up with the change scheme, so it's the gold and the black and the silver underneath, and they loaded it on a flat car and sent it to Chicago. And it ran at Rail Fair in that color scheme. I don't know whether Walt Disney ever rode on it or not, but I know he went to that rail fair, and so he obviously saw this and presumably may have ridden on it. When it came back from rail fair, it was donated to the city of Denver.
Okay.
And 278 and 223, I believe at that time, still serviced the Baldwin branch that we talked about. And eventually 223, then I don't know why it stopped, but 278 was the lone engine still servicing the Baldwin branch, and it required some rework. Now, whether that was associated with that fire or something, I don't know, but what I do know is that the railroad went to Denver and reclaimed 268 and put it in service on the Baldwin branch in this color scheme. so that's why it was back in service, and it served there with 278 for a while. 278 was eventually retired, and then this is the last engine that ran until 1955. Now that gave us two opportunities. So your original question was, what engines did we build and why? Well, 268 sits in Gunnison today, and so you can access it, and to the degree that it's the parts are still there and what have you, take measurements and what have you. And I can talk about this flanger in a minute and how important it was to have the engine there, because this flanger has long since been gone.
Yeah, I for whatever reason, I thought this was a bell.
Well, we'll talk about that. And it's coincidental that that comes up, because it operates a flanger under here, which is never on this locomotive for another reason. But this trip, for whatever reason, I put the flanger in, because people always look at this. Railroaders look at this and they say, what is that? So I'll come back to that in a minute. I'll finish what you're answering your question. 268 then was one. 278 still exists. Of course, it's on the bridge in Cimarron, and accessible. And so that was an obvious choice as well, because it could be documented.
Right.
And so the three engines that were chosen by Peter, Ron, and I were two different versions of 268. So I ended up with the Bumblebee,
right,
1955 version. Peter modeled it as it looked in the 1930s when it was used as a switch engine in Durango. And so there's some differences. His pilot is different, and of course they've got footboards that are designed for the people to be getting off and on frequently, and a number of other things are different. The plumbing's different and what have you. So those differences are characterized in the two engines that we modeled, and Ron did 278.
Right.
So those were three of the four. The fourth one, Stan Marshall respected the fact that it actually was a Cook frame, and there were a few Cooks C16s built for the DNR GW, and he really, there's none of those have survived, and he wanted to model that.
So the actual 268, 278, and 223, they weren't Cook engines.
Correct. Those were Baldwin locomotives.
Okay.
So the four engines originally included two of 268, two vintages, 278, and the fourth one was this 1890s version of a Cook engine.
Okay.
And then subsequent to that, after ours were running, Jimmy Booth picked up we became close friends, and we agreed to help him. And he's as fanatical as Ron, and is very, 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 very detail oriented. Has a long history of the railroad, DNR GW, and the narrow gauge in particular. And so he chose 223 because it was the remaining one which we didn't choose that still exists.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because see, for me, my thinking was like, okay, well, obviously, yeah, the C16 project happened, and then I watched the Mike Massey video on the production,
Right.
and you mentioned that there were four engines, but then like and then the line is Stan Marshall got elderly and had to back out of the project. But my thinking was, well, if the fourth engine was technically a C16, as described in the documentary, where did it go and what was the original plan for it? But you're telling me that it was going to be a Cook engine. Stan respected that fact. It was never intended or designed to be 223.
It was never going to be a DNR GW. The three of them were, and that was going to be a standalone version itself. And then 223 came and appeared later, and so that's the fourth legitimate, Colorado narrow gauge locomotive. And so you can confuse the original four with the final four, but they're different by that one. So there's actually five total.
Okay, five total engines. And so you have obviously 268, 278, the black 268. You have 223.
Yes.
And then you have Stan's Cook.
Correct.
Okay, wow, that is very, very tough to remember.
I saw pictures of that engine in 1938 or 39, something like that, back when it was used as a yard engine. And so it had a wooden platform on the front pilot where they removed some of the I'll call them spokes, and made it so a guy could jump onto that platform and while they were hustling cars around in the yard. So that's one small difference between Bill's engine and my engine.
Okay.
And by the time he was doing that, it didn't have the steam pump on the front or the steam cylinder system to raise and lower a plow.
Okay, yeah, unlike Bill's does.
Yeah, so there are differences like that.
Okay.
But Ron and I went to Colorado a whole bunch of times to make measurements on 268 in Gunnison and 278 as best we could when it was out on the trestle of the, what you call it, canyon. So we got very detailed stuff, and we tried to make it as scale as we could. So we tried to get down to the real nitty-gritty details. We didn't do everything, but we got an awful lot of it.
What was the railroad like in its heyday, your railroad? Like, did you guys have meets? I mean, I know it was a private railroad, but did you ever, like, have meets or anything where people would come over and run, or?
Oh, well, yes, but not meets in the formal sense. People would come by as visitors and bring their engines. Mike Massey came, Jimmy Booth came, Ken Burns came.
Ken Burns as in the Civil War document era?
No.
Okay.
Ken Burns as in the owner of RGS 41, I think it's called.
Oh, okay.
He was up at Train Mountain, I believe. At least his sons were. So anyway, we had various visitors who came and ran, and then we lived nearby, very nearby, the Portola Valley and Alpine Railroad that Bill helped start on Jock Littlefield's property.
Okay.
So a lot of our time we would take our stuff up there and then when we didn't have enough to do on our own railroad, we'd go up there, at least I would go up there and work at the PVMA.
Okay.
So I was involved with Bill on that for many years.
With the Bumblebee 268 being finished in 2009, the railroad was officially completed on June 12, 2011 with a Golden Spike ceremony. So it seemed like everything was going well with the railroad. The engines ran great, a documentary had been done, interviews were being made. Everything was perfect. However, something dark was waiting around the bend.
We found out on my birthday.
In 2004, Ron was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. By the time the Golden Spike ceremony had been completed, Ron had been living with the disease for 7 years. This was the beginning of the end for the railroad. With Ron's mobility fading by 2015 and Peter's eventual move to Washington State, the fate of the railroad was sealed. In the spring of 2016, the last train ran on the Flintridge and Portola Valley Railroad, and 1 year later started to be torn up. Poetically, the rails were torn up in the same way the Baldwin branch was 62 years prior, with F&PV number 1 pulling the scrap train. By 2018, the railroad was gone, leaving behind nothing but a few abutments, concrete piers, and a dirt path where tracks used to lay. The sounds of a C-16 puffing through the backyard hills of Portola Valley, California, would be heard no more. But that wasn't the end of the story. When the railroad shut down, Ron gave portions of it away, mostly to Bill, Peter, and their friend Jimmy Booth. Over the years, these pieces were sold to other people. Peter's part of the rolling stock, including his 268, was sold to Frank Fine, a doctor based out of Modesto, California. So Frank, when you got into the hobby, did you have any prior knowledge of the hobby? Did you did you know it existed before you met Peter and Bill and Ron?
Yes, I was involved in live steam. I'd met, like I told you before, I'd met my neighbor who was building a steam engine at the time, and he helped me build my first steam engine, which was a Little Engines Atlantic 1-inch scale. Then later helped me build an Allen Models 10-wheeler we put together. And so I had a 1-inch track here at my property for a while. Then I sold all the 1-inch stuff, and I went to 1.5 inch and put the steel rail 1.5 inch scale stuff.
Right.
And even bought a GP9 Southern Pacific diesel that I had out here too, and some other engine amp equipment. But then when I watched the movie made by Mike Massey regarding the Flintridge and Portola Valley Railroad, I got really excited about 2.5-inch scale. And I realized it really wasn't available. I mean, either you had to build the stuff, you couldn't just go buy it off the shelf. And
Yeah, that's really disappointing. I wish there was more options for that.
yeah. So what really happened, my first 2.5-inch scale engine was a C16 that I bought from Tom Miller. He was selling his property and all of his equipment, and that was one of the engines that he had. It was built as an 1880s Rio Grande engine, and so I went up there, met Tom Miller, and ran the engine there, and bought it, and he shipped it back to me here in Oakdale, California. And I modernized it. I made it look like an engine from the 30s, and redid the tender so it said Denver Rio Grande Western. And I had a guy.
Was that engine originally the engine by Stan Marshall?
It was. No, it's not that. No, so that engine went to Ray Bajurum in Fresno, who also has a 278. He has both of those engines.
Okay.
And then I got Bill Bowler's number from somebody else I knew in the live steam hobby, and I called him, went over to his house one day and looked at some of his equipment. I actually tried to buy his Shay, but the price was just too high. And then I saw all the Rio Grande stuff he had, and I thought, I like West Side logging stuff, but I love the narrow gauge Rio Grande stuff better.
Yeah.
And so Bill Bowler had all the stuff there at his house, and I just went nuts. And I thought, well, this is great. And then I found out that they were going to have a narrow gauge meetup at Train Mountain. Peter Mosley would be there, so I went up there. They were just having dinner after they'd been running all day. I got up there kind of late. And after they were done, I talked to Peter Mosley, and I told him about I'd been watching the video, and I love your steam engine and equipment and so forth. And he goes, well, if you'd like to see it, he took me over to his container at Train Mountain and showed me the 268 and boots and some other equipment he had stored. And he seemed kind of tired, like he'd been running all day. And he told me, well, I'm almost 80 years old. I think maybe I might want to sell this stuff. And I told him, well, I'd be very interested in buying it. And so anyway, on my way home, he sent me a text and gave me a price. And so I told him yes. Next thing I know, I sent him a check, and I went up to Train Mountain, and he sold me the container, the trains he had in there, his trailer, and his pickup truck.
Bill and Jimmy still have their part of the collection and use it with their respective locomotives. Jimmy got the 464 after Peter gave it to him. Jimmy also has a model of C16 223, built to the same plans as the original 3 engines. Amazingly, the real 223 is being restored to operating condition. Before we go into where everything ended up, let's set a couple of ground rules. The locomotives in rolling stock will be listed with their origins first, followed by where they ended up. Outside of the locomotives, I will not be going to every single piece of rolling stock, as there are too many to count. So assume most cars were sold to various owners or were sold with one of the locomotives, i.e. Peter's 268. I will also list if I've seen the locomotives in person, and locomotives that I don't have information for will be listed as unknown owner or unknown location. Buildings, track, and bridges will be listed the same as well. The person who gave me the information will be listed as well at the end of each entry. The railroad has been gone for nearly 8 years now. The land has changed owners, the rails are gone, reused, and repurposed. Ron has been gone 4 years now, leaving a wife, children, and grandchildren with his legacy. But even though the railroad was short-lived, what Ron, Peter, and Bill created stands out amongst the other private railroads out there. But why? Plenty of other lines have gotten the same amount of attention. What made the F&PV so special? Well, one reason is Ron's attention to detail and showing the hobby what was really possible. Before the F&PV came along, the most common scale to model for the live steam hobby was 1 1/2 inches. For those new to the hobby, 1 1/2 inches on a live steam locomotive is equal to a foot on the real thing. Smaller locomotives were easier to maintain, easier to move around, and were cheaper to build. There were a few 2 1/2 inch scale trains out there, that is 2 1/2 inches is equal to a foot on the real thing, but not as many as there are today. The gauge of track was another change too. Over in the UK, 7 1/4 inch gauge all the way up to 10 1/4 inch gauge was common, and the 7 1/4 inch crowd found its way to the United States. It took root over on the East Coast, but strangely, like the break between narrow and standard gauge, there was a break in miniature gauge as well. Popular legend says that a letter was written to Victor Shattock of the Golden Gate Live Steamers from Carl Puritan, the founder of the International Brotherhood of Live Steamers, in the 1950s, and he accidentally typed 7 1/2 as the standard instead of 7 1/4 inch gauge. Though this has been disproven by Ken Shattock, Vic's grandson, who was a member of GGLS and found records that the issue of track gauge was unresolved with the club until 1957, when it was settled as 7 1/2 as the standard and what the GGLS would end up using, with no mention of a letter. This has resulted in heated debates throughout the years, and most railroads west of the Mississippi are set to 7 1/2 inch gauge, while east of the Mississippi, most tracks are set to 7 1/4, with a few 7 1/2 inch gauge tracks scattered throughout the east side of the country. Another possible reason for the increase of the 2 1/2 inch scale models is the popularity of the narrow gauge. By 1888, the Rio Grande saw the writing on the wall for the narrow gauge and started converting most of their lines to standard gauge. However, some stretches of the line, such as the Royal Gorge, were dual gauged, allowing both standard and narrow gauge trains to run on the same sections of track. By the time the Baldwin branch was scrapped in 1955, other narrow gauge lines had already met the scrapper's torch, or had been converted to standard gauge. The 3 railroads out of Silverton, Colorado had all been scrapped by 1942, and the Rio Grande Southern met its fate only 2 years before the Baldwin branch shut down. The Colorado and Southern had already scrapped most of the Denver, South Park, and Pacific line, starting back as early as 1910, when the Alpine Tunnel was closed for good. That line was gone by the late 1930s, as was the line up to Silver Plume, with the famous Devil's Gate Bridge crossing over the line at Georgetown, Colorado, also owned by the Colorado and Southern. This left the San Juan extension as the last holdout of narrow gauge railroading in the Rocky Mountains, and during its twilight years was photographed by rail fans of the 1950s and the early 1960s. The line's significance was recognized in 1970, when the states of Colorado and New Mexico bought 64 miles of the line between Chama, New Mexico and Antonito, Colorado, reforming it as the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. The Durango to Silverton branch line remained in DNRGW ownership until 1981, when the Durango and Silverton was formed. Both of these tourist railroads have seen increased ridership and popularity over the years. Whatever the reason, 2 1/2 inch scale live steam has been the go-to size for narrow gauge railroading at 7 1/2 inch gauge track ever since the founding of the FP&V. So what does this mean for the railroad? The rails are gone, but is it ever going to be forgotten? What would you like to be remembered about?
Good question. Couple things perhaps. Let me just start with the one that you mentioned originally, which is to participate in this hobby and to benefit from it and the things you get out of it. I'd like to be remembered like Francis Mosley and people like that gave back to the hobby. I'd like people to think that there was an inflection point in the curve. This is pre my existence, this is post my existence, and I helped turn that corner and make things better.
I describe myself as a person who likes to fix things. So that's the kind of stuff I like to do. I can't write my own obituary. I have no idea.
I think the legacy of the Flintridge and Portola Valley is, a lot of people, I think, tried to convey to them that it would be very difficult to build a railroad on such hilly terrain, and they went ahead and did it. And it just shows that if you're dedicated and persistent, that you can accomplish those goals.
Accuracy was his mantra. When he would build these models, the bottom of it would look just like what the real one looked like. And I always asked him, why? Nobody can see it. And he would say, I know it's there.
As long as those 3 engines are maintained by loving, caring people, and the story is told to new members of the hobby, the lasting impact and the legacy of Bill Bowler, Peter Mosley, Ron Schmidt, and the Flintridge and Portola Valley Railroad will continue on for generations to come.